and welcome to Ancestral Recall. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. Ancestral Recall is a web series that gives an oral history of Magic the Gathering through my eyes and shows off the design, the story, famous cards, and hidden gems from days long past. Today's episode looks at the conclusion to Masques block, Prophecy. Prophecy is the last set of Masques block, and it takes place on Dominaria. This is a small set. The story looks at Jamura, the lands depicted in Mirage, and how they are invaded by the Keldon warlords and their thralls. The main point of the story is to show that Dominaria is divided by war and instability, despite Urza's best-laid plans in the face of the incoming Phyrexian invasion. The struggle seems to be helpless against the impending storm of Phyrexia. Now, Prophecy's novel explores a man's journey through suffering and brutality as the Keldons test him in what turns out to be highly effective psychological warfare. It's by no means a fun read, but it was dramatic, and in my mind, the best fantasy war novel Magic's produced. It actually looks at the psychological effects of capture and torture. Now, this novel doesn't really advance the Phyrexian invasion metaplot that much, but it's a wonderful, if somewhat depressing, character study. Mark Rosewater has said that after Homelands, Prophecy was the worst design set of all times that Wizards has printed, because Prophecy's key mechanical conceits, tapping out for benefits, or sacrificing lands for effects, didn't have a connection to the previous sets in the block. And he's right. Being tapped out doesn't interact well with recruiting or spell shapers, and Rhystic magic is so situational. It's based on what your opponent's mana base is. Rhystic spells are the poster child for inconsistency, usually being unplayable if the opponent knows what's coming. With negative mechanics like this, the payoff has to be a big deal, and yet this payoff can't warp the format, so Wizards usually plays it safe with negative mechanics. And I think with Rhystic magic, they played it a little too safe. Some examples of mechanics that cut off other options are Rakdos' Hellbent, Rakdos' Unleash, and demons such as Old School Rakdos and Malfegor. Now, these cards essentially come with giant warning signs on them, telling users to use extreme caution. There's serious cost to be paid for dealing with demons. But that's what makes these mechanics fun. You know what price you're going to pay going in, and wield brutal power despite the cost. Rhystic magic, well, you don't know what your opponent's going to have available. Constant sacrifice for negligible gains, in the case of sacrificing land for effects, that's something that makes players walk away from the game. In my opinion, sacrificing land is the worst feel-bad mechanic in all of Magic. Lands represent not only the ability to play spells, but the future ability to play spells, and they generally have kick-ass art for the most part. And throwing that capacity away just hurts. Destroying my own lands is not something I will shy away from if that's going to be the thing that wins me the game, but just as a process of going through the game, it feels miserable. And Prophecy has more sacrificing land effects than any other set in Magic. In 2014, Magic is bigger than it's ever been, and Wizards hasn't printed any pure downside mechanics in quite a while. It's apparent that Wizards does better when they make mechanics that are upside. Now, I think that's the right direction for the game as a whole, and I'm going to argue that Prophecy is even worse than Homelands in many ways, because it keeps asking players to do something that they're conditioned to dislike, cut off their ability to play their game to the fullest. To its credit, Prophecy has some strong cards. Homelands has a couple of advocates due to its strong flavor, but virtually all the cards in that set were incredibly weak across the board. Now, these two sets are the most commonly discussed sets when it comes to Magic's worst sets. Not just worst design, but just plain worst. But more on that later. Let's get into the cards. Cards of note. Let's start off with the highest profile cycle from the set, the Avatars. Not that Avatar. These expensive beaters cost 8 mana, unless a certain condition is met when their cost goes down to 2 colored mana. The white one can block any number of creatures, which is good, because its discount happens when you're at 3 or less life. That particular condition makes it the worst of the cycle, as all the others can happen when opponents meet certain conditions, and all of these conditions can easily be met in various group game situations. The blue one's discount kicks in when an opponent, doesn't have to be all, has an empty hand. Black's avatar of Keanu, Woe. Avatar of Woe gives you a break when there are 10 creatures in all graveyards, which lends itself very well to EDH group games because the bodies pile up. And Avatar of Woe has the ability to destroy anything it likes, and it also has fear. This is the best of the cycle. And it knows Kung Fu. Red's Avatar of Fury is a simple 6/6 pseudo-dragon that gets cheaper when an opponent has 6 lands. Again, this is easy to meet in group EDH games due to Captain Ramp over there. But Avatar of Fury just lacks punch in comparison to other dragons like Scourge of Kara Ridges. Now, this guy won't have a home in most decks, and it doesn't even fit into Kalia. Avatar of Might hits the table when someone has 4 more creatures than you. And if your table has a player who loves spitting out dudes, this works reliably. But if you're green and someone has vastly more creatures than you, you're probably doing it wrong. Blessed Wind. If you want to start your entire life over again, here's the card to do it, except in Commander. This has been made obsolete by numerous cards, but at the time, Blessed Wind was the biggest life gain effect on a single card that you could get. Since then, Wizards has printed many better life gain cards. Glittering Lion is an example of Rhystic magic at play and is reasonably strong in one-on-one. The ability to make him damageable is pretty expensive. That art, though. And why would I want to play the ability on my own Lion? That makes no sense. Strangely, it has good interactions with Wither and Infect. If you want to see the smaller version, there's Glittering Lynx. Yick, 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 yick. Jeweled Spirit. This card doesn't look too spirity, it doesn't look like it's flying, and it's just plain mediocre. This is part of the sacrifice 2 land cycle. Just saying that makes me feel incredibly lousy. Great art on the kid, though. Okay, here's a card I actually like quite a bit in this set. Magetta the Lion, a legendary spell shaper, does not care about how many guys are on the table, he wants them gone, and his controller will pay a steep price to get rid of him. But he gets to stick around. This is actually an awesome spell shaper, and probably deserves a spot in your cube. Control decks shouldn't mind pitching 2 lands to repeatedly wrath away the opposition. If I ask you the name of a counterspell that costs 0 mana to play, you can almost certainly name Force of Will. You can probably mention Misdirection or Daze. But you probably won't mention Foil, and it's understandable. Pitching an island and some other card to get that counter without mana is a steep cost. But Foil remains an option. I personally collect these in foil. See these? Chinese foil. And I also have a Japanese foil. Foil. Man, I just love saying that. Foil. If someone cuts off 5% of the card, does that make them a foil moil? Sorry, I had that joke in my head all day. If you want to stress out a group game's mana base, then you want to play Overburden. This enchantment doesn't trigger on token production or reanimation, thankfully, but it will drive aggro players up the wall. This card does not play nice with others. This card happens to also occupy a place on my personal troll card list. That's a top 10 list waiting to happen. Rhystic Study. This card annoys the living crap out of me because it slows down EDH tables or gives one guy so many goodies. Card draw shouldn't be that cheap. Now, if Rhystic Study were in decks that throw out gigantic threat after gigantic threat, I wouldn't get that irritated by it. But usually when I see it being played, it's in combo. And I strongly dislike combo or patently unassailable positions in EDH. Now, I'm all for playing decks that deny or remove resources in tournament play. They'll pry the supreme verdicts from my scrabbling claws. But EDH is the place where the big splashy boys should play with clashing titans. Timmy's Playground. That's EDH. Combos winning the game are what pushes me from that format. And Rhystic Study is a major combo enabler. Now, this is the Rhystic card that has stuck around to the point where Wizards gave it a reprint in Commander's Arsenal. I still loathe the card. Spiketail Hatchling and its bigger brother, Spiketail Drake, are callbacks to Mirage's Daring Apprentice, the first creature which allowed players to counter spells. Now, the Hatchling plays like a force spike that can fly in the air, slowly nibbling away at enemies. The bigger Spiketail Drake is an onboard mana leak, but it swings for 3, making it an excellent limited 5-drop for blue. Now, this vertical cycle got completed years later in Time Spiral. In budget cubes, these guys definitely should be given consideration. One of Blue's best bounce spells of all time, Withdraw, is in the set. Now, this common gets to bounce 1 reliably, and can also hit another creature if they happen to be tapped out. Now, this is a pretty solid card in Pauper when your curves are tight. I know that you can always play Undo, which reliably bounces 2 creatures, but Withdraw is instant speed. Greel, Mindbreaker, is one of the scariest legends out there. Now, his activation cost is brutally demanding, as befits Black, but he rewards devotees with a Mind Twist, which is huge card advantage against control players. Thankfully, Greel isn't really playable in EDH. Plague Winds, far inferior to Decree of Pain in my humble opinion, but this was the first Wrath of God Everyone But Me card printed. And that is such a brutal effect. Seriously, it's amazing. Now, Rebel Informer was probably the spell most played from Prophecy in Standard, as it was one of the best answers a Rebel deck had to a resolved Lin Civi. Informer was usually uncastable in most Rebel decks, but you could just recruit it out. Informer was particularly noxious to draw, since you actually couldn't play it from your hand. Aleke boom boom bam! There are some cards that just don't work the same way they used to. Now, if you look at Howling Mine, it has alternated between working and not working when tapped. And then there's Citadel of Pain. Citadel of Pain, as opposed to House of Pain, used to force players to use all their mana and tap out to avoid taking damage at the end of each turn. When Mana Burn existed, this made decisions really hard. But with the end of Mana Burn in 2012, players could simply tap all their mana with impunity. This card still works, because you still get to punish players who love counter magic. But it's so much easier to avoid taking damage now. This won't kill anyone. Keldon Berserker, this is a card that rewards players for tapping out and playing spells pre-combat. Now, this seems a little undercosted by today's standards, unusual for the set, and it was a casual powerhouse. I remember playing this guy in the Slither Precon, which was designed to function optimally when tapped out. This card was accompanied by Spur Grappler, a cheaper 2-1 or 4-2, and Scoria Cat, a 5-mana 3-3 or 6-6. And, back in the day, those were huge stats. Black had a similar creature with Fenstalker, which got Fear when its controller tapped out. If there ever was a set that brought Mana Burn to the forefront of players' minds, it's Prophecy. Yeah. And that's one reason why Prophecy looks bad. Latula, Keldon Overseer, was the main antagonist of the Prophecy novel. She used her thralls for gruesome experiments, many of which were derived from Phyrexian methods to create biological war weapons. And this is represented in the game by throwing fireballs, or blaze balls, whatever. Players were waiting for years and years to have next spell on the stick, and Latula was it. One of the oddest spells in this set is Red's Search for Survivors, which has an opponent randomly pick a card from your graveyard, and if it's a creature, it gets reanimated. This card belongs to the old, bad time period of Red, where Red could do anything in the game across a color pie, if there's some random element to it. Since then, Wizards has recognized that it feels very disappointing for players to get nothing, defeated by their own cards by chance, and so they've shied away from giving Red this type of randomness. Green gets a few nice spells in this set. One of the first land animation spells, Living Terrain, gets printed first in this set. A hasty 5-6 for effectively 5 mana? That's a pretty good deal. At the time, with Rishadan Import in the format though, this guy had some serious trouble. Jolrael, Empress of Beasts, turns your lands into a massive army that turns sideways. She's not as good as Magetta, but she's definitely one of the better legendary spell shapers, and yeah, she sometimes sees plays in Commander. If you can find a way to keep reanimating it every turn, you could play Spore Frog and fog your opponent out for the rest of the game. This is a lot easier to abuse than Infinite Fog. Dual Nature is definitely an amazing token producer if you've got more creature spells than the other guy. Everyone getting double the creatures can certainly spice up your games, but this is risky. Silk Crawler was designed to go with the tap-out creatures. At the time, a 3-3 for 3 mana was a really big deal, and Silk Crawler tapped you out without Mana Burn. But to today's players, it looks like a really bad Nessian Courser. Prophecy's most played artifact in tournaments was Chimeric Idol. The artifact, it transforms into a 3-3 beater at will, and it taps you out. Now, this played well in the Slither precon, and it was a good tool for getting around Wrath of God. And that's all I can really say that's good about this card. But hey, Control was such a big deck at the time that, yeah, having something that ducks Wrath helped. Let's take a short breather for The Price is Right. Nothing breaks $3 in this set. TCG players' mid-price for the booster is $5.50, which is the evidence that the only people who want Prophecy packs are people who want to play older sealed formats or people who just want the novelty of opening old cards. And who am I to question the wisdom of the crowd? Final verdict. Before we get to the specific rating, let's talk about Masques block as a whole. Now, here's what I think Wizards was trying to do. Instead of printing a whole ton of powerful cards, as they did in Urza's block, what they tried to do with Masques block is to make every single draw you get off the top matter. That's the whole premise of Spell Shapers. They turn every single draw you get into a potentially relevant, powerful spell. Now, if every card is worth something, should that create compelling gameplay? That's what Wizards thought. They were designing to give the best players optimal tools to show off, to demonstrate their mastery. This was Magic at its most chess-like, giving players less brutally powerful spells, but giving them lots of opportunities to outplay their peers. This block was designed for spikes. Pushing players to squeeze every advantage out of all their resources meant the Wizards needed to exploit a resource every player had, and with Prophecy that meant lands. That's why Rhystic Magic was added to the set. But they forgot about the sheer fun to be had through experiencing the game. And if you have to give up your lands, you're cutting off a lot of experiences for players. Couple that with other mechanics such as the mana denial of the Spike Tails, the demands of the Rebels for constant land drops, and you had a lot of games that hinged around players cutting off the other guy's ability to do anything. Now, I'm not saying Prophecy is the weakest set of all time, but I can confidently say that it's the most unfun set designed after Tempest, and since I value fun highly, that's the worst set of that time period. Now, I'm going to use Tempest as my benchmark because Tempest is the first set and block to fully realize and transform standard block and draft to be a compelling, highly enjoyable experience. People wanted to play Tempest, unlike Homelands. Now, can I play the ultimate overrun here in Prophecy? Yes, you can. Can I wrath away my opponent's board, leaving my stuff untouched? Yes, you can. But the players didn't enjoy their times with him, generally speaking, especially in Limited. Thank God Wizards followed this setup with Invasion, one of the most interesting sets of all time and a really compelling draft format. With bad mechanics, bad play, and just enough hope in a few cycles to keep players' interest long enough to realize that the set was unfun to play with, Prophecy is on the short list for worst Magic sets of all time. And I'm going to give this set a 3 out of 10, a rating I can only label as bad. Don't get me wrong, Prophecy has potential for fun gameplay, and it certainly tests players' skill. But for newer players looking to explore the past, they're going to find little more than disappointment over the long term. This is definitely the worst ending set for any block. These days I hear a few people complaining about Dragon's Maze, which I suppose was a bit of a letdown for newer players who were used to the higher impact cards of Return to Ravnica, and Gatecrash. But Prophecy was by far worse as a third act. Thanks for watching Ancestral Recall. I hope you enjoyed the show. Next time we're going to be looking at another set far in the past, Homelands. Oh boy. Homelands was the first set to be widely panned by pros and most casual players. How will it stack up against Prophecy? Stay tuned. Now, if you like the show, please tap that like button, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button just as firmly. And hey, why not go back and check my older stuff? This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games, and good luck.